Hi, how are you? We'll get to the suitcase.
You can see he's all packed up and ready to take flight.
Yeah, well, we'll see how this goes. If I have to make a fast getaway, I'm ready. I want to thank Loren, especially for being here tonight to have this conversation with me. Loren Estleman is a titan of crime fiction. One of the twin towers of Michigan crime fiction right there next to Elmore Leonard. I have been, I heard he wrote 80, 90 novels or something. All I know is I've read about a dozen of them, and every one of them rang with power and truth and are fabulously entertaining. The pages fly, so if you haven't gotten acquainted with his work yet, I hope after tonight you will. So it's such a pleasure to be on stage with him.
Thank you, that's so kind.
I was asked to read just a short bit from the new book, Strange Weather, before I sit down, just to give you sort of a taste or a flavor for what my writing sounds like. And so I thought I would read just a page. There are 4 short novels in Strange Weather, and I thought I would read you a page from the last of them. So this is from a story called Rain, and it's the end of the world. A pollutant has gotten loose in the sky, which is causing rain to crystallize. So now rain is falling as nail-like shards of stone. And this turns out to be highly lethal. If you're caught out in it, you're torn to shreds. And if, God help you if you happen to be driving on the interstate, it would be like driving straight into machine gun fire. So this crisis is spreading across the world. And in the midst of it, our hero, Honeysuckle Speck, tries to walk from Boulder to Denver to get in touch with someone she cares about and to bring them some important news. And in the course of the walk, it's a bright, sunny day, and in the course of the walk, she comes along a chain gang, which is sweeping the nails out of the road and trying to clear a path so that traffic can get through and emergency aid can get through up to Boulder. And she winds up hitching a ride with 2 men. One is a police officer named Dillett, and one is a convicted murderer named Teasdale, who had to stop. He was part of the chain gang, but he had to stop after he suffered a severe injury to his foot. So that's where we are. They're getting into the John Deere, and they're getting ready to go. For what it's worth, the back of the John Deere is filled with corpses. Dillett's John Deere was the size of a shed on wheels, and when I was up in the cab, I was a full 9 feet off the road. This was no little family tractor. When he got it going, the engine roar was so loud I thought it might shake the teeth out of my gums. "What did you do?" I asked Teasdale. "Oh, I cut my landlord's head off with a hacksaw," he said in a cheery voice. "It was self-defense, but you can't find a jury anywhere that isn't biased against people who struggle with their weight." "No," I said, "I mean, what happened to your foot?" "Oh, I stepped on an 8-inch nail, went right through the sole of my boot into my heel. Blame my extreme size. When there's been unhappiness in my life, my obesity has usually been the cause." "Ouch, 8 inches. Are you messing with me?" "No," Dillett answered for him. "I took it out myself. It was about the size of a walrus tooth." "I didn't know the nails could get that big." "She ain't heard about Enid," Teasdale said. Dillett looked glum and nodded somberly. "What about Enid?" I asked. "Enid, Oklahoma?" Dillett said, "It's gone. It poured spikes as big as carrots there, killed people in their houses. Storm only lasted 20 minutes, and they're saying over half the city's population was wiped out. The storms are tearing their way east and getting worse as they go. The sparkle dust, the stuff that grows into crystals, is following the westerlies right across the nation." "We can't say we weren't warned," Teasdale told us in a contented tone. "When were we warned it might rain nails?" Dillett asked him. "Was that in the Weather Channel and I missed it?" "It's global climate change," Teasdale said. "They've been talking about it for years. Al Gore, Bill Nye, We just didn't want to listen to them. Dillett couldn't have looked more stunned if Teasdale had opened his mouth and a dove flew out. Climate change, my ass! This isn't climate change. Well, I don't know what else you'd call it. It used to rain water. Now it's raining blades of silver and gold. That is a change of climate. Teasdale rubbed a thumb against his chin, then said, "Ghosts is next." You think it's going to rain ghosts? I think we'll have ghosts instead of fog. The mist will wear the faces of the departed, all those we had and lost. You better hope for clear weather then, Dillett said. If a fog made out of ghosts rolls in, your landlord might turn up wanting his back rent. I count my blessings to live in a dry mountain climate, Teasdale told me complacently. I'll face whatever blows in on the wind. It may come to blow gales of pure sadness instead of air and leave us all taking shelter from grief. Maybe time itself will begin to crest and drop instead of temperature. We might have the 19th century for winter. For all we know, we might have already slipped into the future without noticing it. So about the suitcase, any of you guys watch The Americans? Remember what they did with the suitcase in The Americans? This is what I do with critics. No, 90 books. Loren Estleman's written 90 books.
I remember writing each book. I don't remember writing 90 books.
90 books. I was thinking about doing this when I was asked to do this. I knew I wanted to talk to Loren because I've been reading him, the Amos Walker novels, amazing, bare-knuckled crime novels, terrific. The Page Murdoch westerns, very vivid, unbelievable stories of the Old West, inventive, fresh. The Peter Macklin novels, which is about a contract killer, terrific crime stuff and everything. And I've been reading you across the years, and I thought this might be my one chance to get my book signed. So,
You mean before I die, right?
Yeah. Well, I know that you're advanced in years, and so I brought them, all of them, and I thought, it's fine if Loren wants to ask me questions, but I just thought for every question I have to answer, he should have to sign a book. So
Works for me.
So if that's all right with you.
You got it. Do I get to keep the pen?
Yeah, you keep,
Good,
that's
good,
yours,
good.
from me to you.
Right.
Right. So go ahead,
right.
shoot. Let's go for it.
Well, I think particularly from what we just heard, there are several things you will notice. One, you will notice a crackling dialogue,
Yeah.
which is something I always look for in a writer, because I think you can get good dialogue is action.
Yeah.
And you can get a lot of information across, and it sounds like the way people really speak.
Yeah.
But is that the way people really speak, or are you creating an illusion of the way people speak?
Yeah, I don't think that if you represent the way people really speak, you'd have a lot of stammering and repetition, and you'd have a very tiresome 3 or 4 pages to read. But you wouldn't know any more after you read, 3 or 4 pages of dialogue than you knew before you read them. So that is the art, is to find the rhythm and music of real speech, and to try to bring to life different voices, expressive of different characters, but somehow it has to kind of move and have a rhythm to it, and move the story forward at the same time. And I've thought for years that really, if you can learn to write dialogue, that will cover for almost all of the deficiencies. I mean, if the rest of your writing game is weak, but you can write good dialogue, it's amazing what you can get away with. And I think a lot about Gregory MacDonald, who wrote the Fletch novels. There was a bunch of movies about Fletch. Chevy Chase was in them, and
The books are almost all dialogue.
the books are all dialogue.
Right.
There's no description at all,
Right.
and you'll read a whole chapter of just people talking, and only when you get to the end of the chapter you realize both characters were naked the whole time.
Right.
Which is sort of a wonderful trick. This is Loren's new one. It's a black and white ball, available at bookstores everywhere for very reasonable prices. And the great thing about buying a book is they wrap beautifully for Christmas. So I only mention it
Thank you, sir. Talk among yourselves. I'll introduce a subject. The Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Talk among yourselves.
This is how I beat the line. I don't like to wait in line.
It's always so exciting to watch, too, isn't it?
Don't worry, there's only 89 more to go.
There we go, sir. The other thing, and I think it's almost a secondary thing that people notice when they read, and it's usually one of the first things I notice, is you have a very visual style.
Yeah.
And in my case, I like to write visually, but I studied art for 12 years. Did you have a close exposure to art in any way?
No, but I read a lot of rotten comic books when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. You know, my experience of art was largely limited to the X-Men. But I do think, you know, it's interesting, because I do think on the one hand, having a crisp visual imagination is exciting for readers and really exciting for film and TV producers, because they want pictures, not words. Mm-hmm. You know, and so if you can paint a vivid picture, an arresting picture, that'll grab people. But I also think that description is dead, that every line of description, of passive description, is a lead weight that you're asking your reader to carry. You know, and I'm sure you've all felt that if you've ever been reading a book and you turn the page and there's a paragraph that's a whole page long and your heart just wilts, you know, and you think to yourself, oh, that looks like homework, you know? Maybe I'll just put it down and I'll check Twitter. And in this way, many good books go to their deaths. So I mean, I think that's the other challenge is you've got to keep the beat moving. You know, you want to create a vivid picture, but you don't want to dwell on it. There has to be, you said dialogue is action. And I really think that's the one thing that keeps a story going is relentless action. And even if nothing is happening, even if it's just a guy thinking through his interior thoughts have to almost be like relentless action or we tune out. I mean, it's terrible that we all have such short attention spans, but it's true of me too. You know, I hate to be bored. I can't, we went out to dinner earlier and we were talking about Somerset Maugham, and he was talking about how great Maugham was. My dad's been trying to get me to read Maugham for years, and the first thing I asked Loren was, will I be bored? You know, I can't stand to be bored.
Never. Two, dialogue, and I think that was a good example. You got to...
Go on.
Go ahead.
No, go on.
I'll sign two next time. How's that? You got a lot of information across there in a very short period of time, just between that back and forth between those three characters. Is that deliberate, or do you decide, am I going to do this narrative?
I also got to show off my literary pedigree while I was doing it, because the convict who cut off his landlord's head with a hacksaw is named Teasdale. Teasdale is a reference to the poet who wrote a poem called There Will Come Soft Rains, which is a classic little piece of poetry, which was later turned into a Ray Bradbury story called There Will Come Soft Rains, which is about the end of the world. So I do like to play my own little, to put stuff in the story that's like, because I hate to be bored, so I've got to stick stuff in there.
The nice thing about inside jokes is nobody ever gets them.
I know. I am strictly amusing myself.
I will sign another.
Yeah, okay.
It's like watching grass grow, isn't it?
How many years did you live in Detroit?
Actually, I've never actually lived inside the city limits of Detroit. Spent
No
a lot of
kidding.
time there. But I grew up within an hour of it, and everything comes filtered through Detroit in that, when you're that close to the city. So it gave me a knowledge of Detroit, an intimate knowledge of Detroit from everything coming through there and spending as much time as I have, but it also gave me a little bit of distance and objectivity.
My sense is that it's basically the Thunderdome now. Is that correct? That
Yeah.
my sense is that it's a fragmented and burned out wasteland populated by the slow mutants. But I don't know. Is that fair?
That's actually pretty much it.
Really? Really?
Now it is true. A lot of good things have happened in the last few years, and they keep saying Detroit is coming back. it doesn't necessarily mean you're all coming back with it. So it has a long way to go.
I'm rooting for Detroit. Don't get me wrong. I'm rooting for Detroit.
I have always had a love-hate relationship with the city, and I think you have to write about a city with any kind of convincing ability.
Yeah.
And it's been good to me, I have to say. When I began writing the Amos Walker series back in 1980, locals would tell me nobody's going to want to read about Detroit. So I set out to prove them wrong. And just within like the last 2 years, suddenly I've had publishers saying, how much more of Detroit can you give us? Can you give us some more Detroit? I have to say a number of things about that city is that the people are terrific. People who live in that city, and it's maybe the only city in the United States that you can say that if you live within the city limits of Detroit, it means you have no means of getting out. So they make the best of it. They take care of their community. They take care of their neighborhoods as much as they possibly can. And when Detroit does come back, it's going to take a partnership. It's going to take a partnership between government, business, willing to put money into the city, and the people who are already living in the city who are already doing what they can to make that place a better place to live.
Most of what I know about Detroit I learned from Amos Walker novels, so my impression is that it's largely overrun with gangsters.
Oh yeah, they're great to write about.
Yeah.
They're a lot of fun. They really are.
The other thing I know about Detroit I learned from listening to Journey, where he says, he was born and raised in South Detroit, and I was horrified to discover there's no South Detroit.
There is no South Detroit.
Apparently. But doesn't every city have a South somewhere? I mean, how could you not? It's like geography, there's north.
Well,
anyway.
it's kind of at an angle. So even when you talk about the west side of Detroit, you're actually kind of talking about the northwest side.
I see.
It's on that little twisted corner of the river. It's amazing how many times Hollywood has gotten to what they get right and what they get wrong. There was a movie some years ago called True Romance. Is anybody familiar with this film? Fascinating crime film. And it takes place in Detroit, and a lot of it was shot in Detroit. Has Dennis Hopper and some terrific actors in it. But one of the characters in it mentions a party store, which if you live in Michigan, you know that we call, what other people call convenience stores, we call them party stores. That's a very local thing. They got that right. And then he'll mention 115th Street, which we don't have in Detroit.
It reminds me of these. I saw this. Microphone failure. It reminds me of there's a part, if you watch war movies, there's a war-torn part of the Mideast. It's sort of located in east of San Diego.
Right.
The desert, yeah, and so that sort of appears to be the most violent part of the Mideast, actually. But anyway, so go on, proceed.
Well, basically, I don't want to make it all about me, but it is. It's been a great place to write about because people ask me, "Why do you write about Detroit?" And I say, "I don't live near San Francisco."
Yeah.
But it's a city with many different textures, and every time I'm looking for what facet of Detroit am I going to write about now, I will take another look and just kind of turn the globe a little bit. And what haven't I written about Detroit? I was several books into that series before I dealt with the auto industry. And you would think that would be the first thing you'd go into, but there were so many things to do.
Years ago, I was invited to write a short story about Abraham Van Helsing, and I agreed to do it. It was in the very early stage of my career, and I needed every sale I could get. And I remember thinking, writing about Abraham Van Helsing would be the easy part. The hard part was I had to get him to America somehow. Because like if I said it in London, I didn't know anything about it. Like he'd be running around in the fog saying, "God save the Queen" or some such shit, And so you do. It's funny because I feel like I'm pretty good at inventing people different from myself. What is hard to do is to capture a place, to have a setting that you know nothing about. That strikes me as very difficult. When I write about New England, I feel like I know what the roads are like in the winter. I know what the geography is like. I know what it's like to work there, and I don't know how would I write about Hungary. I'd have to go. If I was going to write about the Ukraine, I'd have to go, and even if I was there I don't know how it would be hard. I'd know so little.
That is true. My second novel, which the world will never see, I wrote at the age of 24, and it was a 600-page novel about Ivan the Terrible. Set in 16th century Russia. I'd never been out of Michigan at the time. apart from sharing the same climate, I knew nothing at all about the place. So it was basically stillborn.
Yeah.
That was the novel that taught me never to write in longhand again.
Yeah, I wrote for about 7 years in longhand. I wrote my last novel, The Fireman, I wrote the entire thing in longhand, and it fills 7 huge Lexstrom 1917 journals. But now I seem to have gone back to the computer. My wrist got worn out. It was a big book.
Right.
Yeah.
You said something in the afterword of Strange Weather, which really resonated with me. The virtue of the short novel.
Yeah. I mean, I can find, I've done short stories, I've done comics, I've done long novels, I've done sort of ordinary sized novels, if there is such a thing. But Strange Weather is a collection of 4 short novels, and yeah, I think there's advantages to all the forms. But for stories of the weird and fantastic, stories of suspense, there seems to be a sweet spot of between about 75 and 150 pages. And when I go through in my head, and I think about the real landmarks of horror and suspense, I think about stuff like Turn of the Screw, short novel, very short novel. The Strange Case of Jekyll and Hyde, it can be read in a single sitting. Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman is more recent. I think it's his finest novel. It's about 170 pages, can be read maybe a weekend. Haunting a Hill House, Woman in Black. All these are stories that do their work and get the job done very quickly. There's no spare fat on them. Nothing is wasted. No scene is wasted. They're lean and mean, and it's that idea that you should live fast, die young, and leave a beautiful corpse. That's a terrible plan for a human life, but is actually a pretty good plan for a story. Not to waste a moment of people's time. And a short novel has the advantages. They have the velocity of a short story. The kind of promise that, like, I'm not going to take up too much of your time. But they have the depth of characterization that we associate with the novel, and I find that a very appealing mix.
I think I agree with that. When I was a small boy in the 50s, the most popular books were these 25-cent paperbacks, usually mysteries. And to this day, when I'm going to fly somewhere and I need something to read, I always have to have something to read. It'll take me 15 minutes to pack and 2 hours to pick my reading material for the trip. Because the file lines get kind of long, you don't want to be stuck with a
I brought all my reading
novel.
material with me this
Very
time.
good.
Yeah.
And these novels, which are like 160 pages usually, about maybe 60,000 words, they would slide right inside my inside sport coat pocket. Didn't have to fumble in my luggage to get it out while people are waiting to go down the aisle. And I would sit down, usually with a long plane ride that would last just right for the right length of time for the ride. But I will read the opening line, and I want to go out and strangle 5 of the 10 best-selling writers on the New York Times list, because on their best day, they could not write a line as tight as that.
Yeah.
They were so tight, and they were so crisp.
I love those old 50s crime paperbacks that have, it's always got some girl kind of falling out of her dress, and she's smoking a cigarette, and her hair is down over one eye, and then you got this kind of thuggish guy sitting on the edge of the bed with
a hat,
with the gun, on, and he's wearing his wife beater and stuff, and the most beautiful part of the cover is the thing that says 35 cents in the upper corner.
Yeah, I've told my publishers for years that they're asking too much for their books. And back in the 1950s, people would go into a drugstore, they would buy a half dozen of those at a pop, knowing that they could pay for them out of pocket, and everybody profited from that.
So the same thing happened to comic books. I worked in comic books for years. I was really a comic book writer before I was a novelist. My big professional breakthrough was I wrote an 11-page story for Spider-Man. But it used to be, I look at Silver Age comics from my youth, comics from the 70s and stuff, and they have these, astonishing covers. The most incredible part of the cover is it says 25 cents in the upper corner.
Right.
Now a comic book costs $5.
When I was a kid, they were 10
$5.
cents. They were 10 cents. Then they went to 12 cents. And when they went to 15 cents, it was about the time.
I thought it was the barter system when you bought comics as a kid. Wasn't it like, were you even on money then?
I never got rid of them once. I still have all those comics. Don't rob me. I wore the covers off them. I got to say, they aren't worth anything. But.
Well, that's the other thing is I know there's I have some friends in the audience who run a comic book store not too far from here, and they came up to visit, and I love the comic book stores, but they also make a lot of money selling you bags and boards and everything, and don't stick your comic books in there. Your comic books want to breathe. Let them be free.
I had like the first Spider-Man and all these great comics.
Wow.
And in high school there was this lovely 20-year-old teaching assistant who was, she asked to borrow some comics. And I didn't ask why, I just took out all my great comics and dumped them on her. And she shared them with everybody in her dorm at the U of M. And,
oh, really?
And they didn't come back.
Yeah,
I didn't get laid either.
Oh.
I didn't mean to. What's that line from Pulp Fiction? I'm sorry, did I break your concentration?
I don't know where I thought we were going with that. Not there. Yeah, well, comic books have grown up. They're very dirty now. Very inappropriate. I hope you're all reading them. There's this thing now. Thank you.
Thank you.
87 to go. There's a day now on social media ruins everything. Now there's a hashtag on social media, read comics in public day, and it's like supposed to be like, you're celebrating comic books. You're not ashamed anymore. I don't want that. I want you to feel dirty while you're reading them. It should feel almost like one step away from looking at pornography.
Yeah,
the second it becomes respectable, all the fun is gone.
That's what I always have. I thought if if a teacher finds some student reading Crime and Punishment with your book on the outside, something's going wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I want to be the secret guilty pleasure. I don't want you, if you're reading me in public, you should feel filthy and ashamed.
And which books do you remember? Do you remember Silas Marner, or do you remember the Mickey Spillane novel you read under the covers with a flashlight?
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Those are the things that stick with you. Ooh, and there it goes again. Maybe I'll just
You can tell he's a writer. We aren't ballet dancers.
Yeah, I'll put it there. The Mickey Spillane started writing comic books as well.
He did, yeah.
And I do think, and you've done a fair amount of journalism, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that if you want to become a writer, that's the way to start. Is either start in comics or start in journalism, because in both cases you learn things that you have to know about economy. About getting the story out there and told in a very limited amount of space. And you also learn stuff about getting the important ideas up front. When I started writing seriously, and was concerned about getting published, I collected a lot of rejections, hundreds and hundreds of rejections. And it took me a long time to learn, I would write short stories that had very good ideas in them, but I wouldn't get to the good idea until page 15. And that is about 14 and a half pages too late.
Right.
It's got to be right there on the first page, first chapter, maybe the first paragraph, first sentence. And actually, when I look, my first published book was a collection of stories called 20th Century Ghosts. And now when I go through it, it's so interesting to see how often I basically describe the whole story in the first paragraph. There's a story in there called Pop Art, and the first sentence is, when I was 12 years old, my best friend was an inflatable boy. But I had to get it. I have to have it right up there in the front because I was worried no one would read the second sentence. In comic books, though, you learn stuff about action right in the first panel. That's what they're paying for.
Splash panel.
Big splash panel.
Yep.
Spider-Man is putting a boot in someone's ass. You better have it right away because people see that. And when I talked to I talked to a group of young writers today, and I was talking about distraction, because we live in really distracted times. You all have the devices of distraction on you right now, stuck in your pockets. It's just this bottomless pit of stuff to look at, and we've all done it too, where you fall into the internet hole and don't come out for hours. You come out kind of groggy later. I once went online to look up one fact about a gun for a story I was writing. 2.5 hours later, I realized I was reading up about the voice actors in Scooby-Doo. What happened? That's 2.5 hours of my life I can never have back, you know? So, you know, if you're a writer, you have to be aware that you're competing with Netflix, you're competing with Amazon Prime, you're competing with Facebook, you're competing with PlayStation and Xbox, and there's just so little reason for anyone to give you their time, let alone their money. And so I obsess over how to keep people reading. And what I said to the kids I was talking to today is, if you're walking along a street and you look up at a building and you see a man 10 stories up and he's crawling on a ledge to rescue a kitten, you stop and you look. Maybe you don't want to see what's going to happen next, but you can't help yourself. It's a human response. And I basically view my job as putting someone out on the ledge and then keeping them there as long as I possibly can. And if they finally get to the kitten, you know, then the kitten scratches them in the face. You know, because I'm always terrified the second they get off the ledge, you know, the story's over. And so I think I've written stories of the supernatural, and I sometimes get asked if I'll ever write stuff that's not supernatural. I have actually written some stuff that's not supernatural. What I don't know if I'd trust, I don't know if I'd have the courage to write something that didn't have a very strong element of suspense, because I'm very insecure, and all I can imagine is people putting the book down. And I don't know how I'd write I don't know how I'd write like a John Updike type novel. I'm not saying they're not brilliant. I'm just saying they're really boring.
You know, I agree, and I think.
Sorry, you know. Nothing. They're beautifully written, but nothing ever happens. And
yeah,
you know, he made a whole career out of that.
It's not my cup of tea. And Carson McCullers is a novelist I love to read. It's fascinating all the way, and at the end you finish, and your first reaction is, "Huh?"
Yeah.
Speaking of that.
Yeah.
Aloft. What the hell was that?
So there's four.
Not dull.
Right. So there's 4 short novels in Strange Weather, and I told you about one. I told you about Rain. The other 3 is, the first story is called Snapshot, and it's about a young kid who runs afoul of a dangerous man that has a Polaroid camera that steals memories. Every time he takes a picture, you lose something in your head. And the second story is called Loaded, and that's a story about gun violence in America. You know, because when I think about what's scary, really scary, you know, I don't think about a clown hiding in the sewers or like a rabid dog or something.
Yeah, who would come up with a stupid idea like that?
Right. You know, I think about a single white male with a gun, most terrifying thing in the world. You know, but then there's this story Aloft, which is a little bit lighter than the other stories in Strange Weather. That's a story about, Aloft is about a young man who wants to impress a girl. And so he goes skydiving, and he winds up stranded like Robinson Crusoe on an island of cloud, a semi-solid island of cloud, 10,000 feet above the ground. And because of what's happened, I won't ruin the whole thing, he's lost his parachute, and he has no way down. You know, and he's like waving. It's like Castaway, only in the sky. He's like waving to planes, but like, you know, a plane a mile away is not going to see a little figure on a cloud. And the cloud itself is kind of alive. You know, he's wearing a helmet, and he takes it off, and he's looking around for a place to put it, and then and there's a coat rack has sprung up out of the cloud. He puts it on, you know, but the cloud loves him. It wants to give him things. It gives him a bed. It gives him a toilet. You know, he gives him food, but it turns out eating cloud fruit isn't a very good idea, and he gets explosive diarrhea. And fortunately, the cloud also gives him toilet paper. And like, unlike real toilet paper, the cloud toilet paper never runs out. You can just keep pulling, and there's just always more. It gives him a cloud girlfriend.
See, that story had a dream quality to it.
Yeah.
It's one of those that it makes sense all the time you're living through it. And it's only when you wake up at the end you look back and
You're
say,
like, what the hell was that?
Hell was that? Yeah.
I was thinking about, you know, like I say, I have a comic book imagination, and I was thinking a lot about Little Nemo and Slumberland, and the strange quality of those. You know, I don't know. That was done by Walter McKay, and it's a comic strip from the 1920s and 30s.
Beautifully drawn,
so beautifully drawn. People have really forgotten the artistry of the comic strips of the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, not just Little Nemo, but, Prince Valiant. I mean, every frame of, it's amazing to think that Hal Foster, who did Prince Valiant, did it for 50 years. And every panel has this beautiful painterly quality to it. And he just churned them out, day after day, and amazing production. But yeah, I was thinking about the kind of dreamlike quality of that sort of thing, a Little Nemo. Yeah.
I think your stories, and Snapshot was one of those, they do carry a strong mystery quality. Because it's a while before you let us know that what exactly this camera is doing. And you give us a clue at one point. And as many mystery novels as I've written, I can almost never solve another mystery writer's mysteries. And that was one where I began to see what you were getting at. But I think I saw where you were headed at the very moment you wanted me to see it. And I think it's the moment when the boy, and you have these wonderful wounded characters who are your protagonists as a rule. He's a fat boy dealing with all that ridicule
overweight,
and all that
very, and he's talking about what it was like to be overweight in the 80s before there was even the term fat shaming.
And there's a moment where he accidentally trips the camera himself, and it takes a picture of a fellow he knows, and then suddenly the guy doesn't remember him anymore.
Guy doesn't remember him anymore.
And it was until that moment you are in suspense as to what the hell is going on here. Because you get this clue from the old lady who has Alzheimer's who says, don't let him take your picture.
There's a couple things to respond to there. One is, so the story is partially, it's set in the 1980s, and it's about this kid, who was looked after for a long time by a woman who lives around the corner. And in the opening of the story, she's out wandering barefoot in her pajamas, and she's got a purse full of garbage that she's picked up. She's clearly very disoriented and confused. And I wanted to write a story about Alzheimer's, but I wanted to give us someone we could punch. Because, many people see loved ones, lose it all, their thoughts, their memories, their whole life stripped away to them. And in some ways that seems crueler than death, to have your personality slowly pulled away. And there's no one to fight, you just want to punch someone, but unfortunately Alzheimer's doesn't have a face, and so in the story, that's one of the things hopefully that fiction can do is, you can vicariously get some kind of release against, the awfulness of life that normally you can't respond to. But the other thing is, I do think all my stories have a mystery component to them. They're not whodunit stories. They're, who are these people? Who is he? My first novel, Heart-Shaped Box, is about a heavy metal musician who buys a ghost online. He has a collection of macabre artifacts. He's got a trepan skull. He's got a witch's confession from the 18th century. And he hears about a woman selling a ghost online and decides he needs that for his collection. And the guy we meet at the beginning of the story, he's 60. He's on the downslope of his career, but he's had it all. He's played arenas. He's had platinum albums. He did music videos in the 80s for MTV. He was an MTV star. And when we meet him, he's so angry, and he's lonely and isolated, and he's cruel to the people who love him. And I got wondering about him. Who is this guy? How did he wind up this way? And he became almost this thing I needed to investigate. And it took me about 300 pages to find out who he really was. And gradually I did discover that he was a better man than we thought he was at first. That there's actually a much more decent, caring person under the surface, but he had kind of strapped on this armor, the armor of his rage to protect himself from any more loss. He had already had enough.
Yeah, I think what I like about your characters and the way you handle them is you will take a character who is in anybody else's hands is an out-and-out villain, and somehow, and I think, does it have to do maybe with, and somehow he's sympathetic to a certain degree. Is it because the villain doesn't realize he's a villain, or is it something else?
You should be able to, I do believe that in a good story, you should be able to almost imagine a way to rewrite it where the villain is the good guy. So I wrote this story, The Fireman, and The Fireman is an apocalypse story. It's about a runaway pathogen called dragon scale. And the stuff is spreading everywhere, and you get it on you, and it's like, it almost looks like a tattoo. It's a beautiful black scroll work. But when you get anxious, it starts to smoke. And if you can't control your fear, you burst into flames and die of spontaneous combustion. Hospitals are burning down all over America. Cities are on fire. You know, it's this uncontrollable crisis. Well, the heroes in the story are two people who are infected. And there's a gang of people who are out hunting them. Because the one thing that they know is the healthy people know if you shoot someone who's sick with this stuff, they won't be afraid anymore, and there's no risk they'll burst into flames. So you can stop the spontaneous combustion by killing someone. I was thinking about Walking Dead, you know, and that guy in the cowboy hat, you know, and it's like, Walking Dead is a story where it imagines a tiny few people who are like, you know, normal and healthy and well, and then everyone else in the world is sick and filthy, and it's like the only way to be safe is almost to build a wall between you and them. You know, if you could just keep them on the other side of the wall, you'd be safe. And you know, they've got the people on you know, the healthy side of the wall have all the guns, and you know, and when they kill someone who's sick, it's a mercy. You know, it's actually, you can actually feel good every time they shoot someone in the head. You can cheer because you're like, boy, another one of those nasty things killed. And a little part of me is kind of like, I feel like I kind of want to root for the sick. You know, I don't really want to be on the side of the healthy exterminating the ill. I think I'd rather be on the side of the sick, you know, struggling to survive. You know, again, I feel like that's more the underdog. That's more interesting. So basically, The Fireman is an inverted version of Walking Dead. I did another book called Nosferatu. And Nosferatu is about a kind of vampire named Charlie Manx. Charlie Manx drives I'm doing the car. Charlie Manx drives a 1938 Rolls-Royce Wraith, and he takes children and he gets them in the back of it, and he drives them to this awful fantasy world called Christmas Land. And you know, and when they're in the car, when they're on the drive, he drains all their sadness out of them, all their grief, all their rage, all their regret, and leaves nothing but happiness and innocence. You know, so by the time they get to Christmas Land, in Christmas Land, unhappiness is against the law. And all the children there are relentlessly happy. They're happy no matter what they're doing. They're happy whether they're opening Christmas gifts or riding amusement park rides or playing a game called Scissors for the Drifter, where they have scissors and they chase a homeless guy around the park. Because the thing about innocence is an innocent child will rip the wings off a butterfly. Because they're innocent, they don't know they're doing something wrong. Now, Charlie Manx is a pretty terrible guy, but when I wrote it, I was, you know, it's sort of, all he wants is kids to be happy and safe. In a weird way, isn't that almost like he's the hero of the story? And I wrote it, I had gotten divorced, and I thought after the divorce, I've ruined my kids' childhood. They're gonna have a terrible, terrible child, and I was determined that it wouldn't happen. And so I became the emperor of fun. And like for 18 months, everything we did had to be relentlessly fun. You know, I did this thing called the Daddy Drive-In, where I put up a big sheet out back, and we watched old movies every night. And you know, we got into Doctor Who, and we all had matching Doctor Who sneakers, and the Chuck Taylor All-Stars. Very cool. You know, and they'd get out of school and I'd be like, let's drive 45 minutes to this place that has all these old arcade games and stuff. And I was a maniac, you know. And then at some point, about a year and a half after the divorce, I thought, what are you doing? You know, they went through a divorce too. Shouldn't they feel some regret? I mean, isn't that healthy? To feel a little grief and a little sadness, and isn't that partially how we become complete human beings? Your regret, your grief, your guilt, they make you a more full human being. Empathy depends on the ability to feel sadness. If you couldn't feel sadness, you wouldn't give a damn about anyone.
If you weren't cold, you wouldn't know what warm is.
That's right. That's right.
So is that what triggered the idea then? That specific thing?
Not really, not really. I came to Charlie Manx a little bit later. Originally the idea, there's a woman in the story named Vic McQueen, We meet Vic, she's just a kid, she's just 12 years old. And we follow her for about 30 years of her life. Vic also has a supernatural power like Charlie Manx. She can find things, anything that's lost, anything that she needs to find, she can find if she's on the right ride. When she's a kid, it's her Raleigh Tough Burner bicycle. When she's a grown-up, it's her 1968 Triumph Bonneville motorcycle. But if she wants to find something, say a lost bracelet, she goes looking for it, and she always finds her way to this covered bridge that doesn't really exist. It only exists in her head. And whatever she's looking for is always on the other side of the covered bridge. I had a chance to stand on that covered bridge about a week ago. AMC is making Nosferatu as a TV show, 10 episode. The first season will air in June next year. Charlie Manx is played by Zachary Quinto, who was Spock in the Star Trek films, is a terrific actor, and I've seen him as Charlie, and there's just this terrific mix of wit, grace, and malevolence. And so I'm tremendously excited for that. It'd be great to see what they do. And it was very strange to step into the bridge, to enter Vic's covered bridge, because it was like, A, it was like stepping into my own imagination, but B, it was also like stepping back into my childhood, because the covered bridge that Vic rides across was a real place in my childhood across the Penobscot River in Bangor, Maine. And we were all scared. It was dilapidated, and we were all terrified of it, but we dare each other to ride our bikes across it. And so that was how you proved you were fearless, was by riding your bike across this rickety covered bridge, which later was torn down, no longer stands. It was very strange to go back there, to suddenly be walking back onto this bridge that hasn't existed in the real world for 30 years.
Fascinating. This gives me a chance to think about another question. Thank you. You paid that much for this?
Oh, price tags in there?
And they saw you coming.
They didn't give me the 20% off. No,
figures. People ask, you get this, I get this, I think every writer does, and there's really no answer to it. They ask, where do you get your ideas?
Yeah.
But what I like to know as a writer, from a fellow writer, is how an idea becomes a story. And when you get an idea, do you immediately start making notes? Do you immediately go into that project, or does it have to gestate for a while?
These were the first two. Instead of answering his question, I'm going to advertise his books. These were the first two Loren Estleman novels I read. Motor City Blue. Is that the first one?
That was the first Amos Walker.
That's the first Amos Walker. And then Stamping Ground, which is one of the early Page Murdocks.
Yes. That was the second Page Murdoch.
This is some bare knuckle fiction right there. I love these books. What are you asking? What did you ask me? How do ideas make it onto the page?
One of us has to be listening. No, when you get an idea, when it comes to you, do you immediately jot it down? Do you go right into the project, or do you need to let the idea gestate?
Well, sometimes they brew for a really long time, and sometimes not too long. The story Loaded, which is about gun violence, thank you. Mm-hmm. The story Loaded, which is about gun violence, I had that idea. I saw the whole thing very clearly, beginning to end, within a couple weeks of what happened at Sandy Hook. But I didn't write it for 3 years. It just sat there in my head. And it's funny how the good ones stick. You don't forget them. You can write them whenever. You can write them, once you've got them worked out, you can start writing right away, or you can just let them float for years, and then when you're ready to write them, they'll be there for you sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. Other times, I'll have an idea and I'll start writing almost right away, and usually that's a big mistake. Oof. A lot of times you wind up with something. I definitely think it's like brewing tea, or
it has to steep, right?
Yeah, it has to steep for a little while. I did this comic book, Lock and Key, which is about an enchanted New England mansion full of impossible keys. Every key opens a different door and activates a different supernatural power. And I did that. I had this big breakthrough where I got to write a Spider-Man story. And after that, I was hot to write more comics. And I came up with this pitch, and I sent it to Marvel, and they passed on it. And I sent it to DC Comics, and they passed on it too. And Dark Horse passed on it. A bunch of other comic companies passed on it. But I didn't pass on it. And I had little kids at the time, and I always ran out of diapers at 1 in the morning. You never run out of diapers in the middle of the day. So it'd be 1 a.m, I have to go out for diapers. And I'd go to Walgreens, I'd be like half awake, and I'd come up with an idea for a new key. I think that's pretty cool. So by the time I finally got to write the comic, I had been thinking about the story for like a year and a half. I got to tell you one thing about going to Walgreens at 1 a.m. I had babies, little babies. I had to go for diapers, and I got to Walgreens at 1 a.m. I was just punch drunk. I was so tired, and I'm walking around, and the loudspeaker says, "Remember, we're 50% off on lunch meats." And that was so musical, that word, lunch meats. I started walking through the aisles, and I started going, lunch meat, lunch meat, and I came around the aisle and bumped into this woman, and I'm like going, lunch meat? And she's like, oh! And I'm like, oh my God, oh my God. And so I bought the diapers, and I ran outside, and I got in a red car, and I closed the door, and I'm sitting in the red car, and I'm putting the keys in, and funny, the car wouldn't start. And then I started to think, I didn't take the red car. I took my wife's car. And suddenly I see it, the whole thing. She's going to come out and find me in her car. And she's going to be like, he was screaming about his lunch meat, and then he was waiting for me in the car. I'm going to do 15 years as a sex criminal. Do you want to know something really terrible? You want to know something really terrible? It didn't happen. None of it happened. It's just, I was in Walgreens and I heard lunch meat, and then I started working on the story, and that's kind of what you have to do. It's like you're always kind of looking like, what would be the worst case scenario here? And I was thinking, well, what if I was going lunch meat and I scared someone and then I got in the wrong car, and it's almost like the first chapter of a really upsetting novel about how an innocent guy goes to jail, and then hopefully more funny but terrible stuff would happen to him, but you kind of, that's, I don't know if it's the good or the bad part of writing. You're constantly kind of churning and seeing if you can't find something that you can make the next story out. I had a lot of sympathy for Philip Roth. After he stopped writing, he said, the work is over. And he said, the best thing about it is now a conversation is just a conversation. It used to be, when I had a conversation, I was filtering everything to see, is there something here? Where's the next bit of material? And he's like, now I just talk to friends. I thought, I can see how that might be kind of nice. Yeah.
Remember, there's a wonderful movie, Stranger Than Fiction. I think it's the only Will Ferrell movie I really like. It's Will Ferrell and Emma Thompson. And Emma Thompson is a novelist, and Will Ferrell suddenly, he's a guy who works for the IRS. He's a tax auditor. And suddenly he hears a narration, somebody's narrating his life.
Yeah.
And he hears this voice. It turns out to be Emma Thompson. She doesn't know it that she's writing about a real guy. And there's one point when she says, little did he know that his death was imminent. So he's screaming at what? Whose death is imminent? When? And he goes through all this time trying to find out who she is. He finally finds her. But this wonderful line, her whole problem is she's having a bad case of writer's block. She hasn't been able to publish a book in 10 years because the character's name is Harold Crick, and all of her books end tragically. And she can't figure out how to kill Harold Crick. So the publisher sends her an assistant who will help her arrive at a conclusion, and Queen Latifah is the assistant. And finally, she comes out, and at one point, Emma Thompson is out there, and she just sees a green apple rolling down the street. And suddenly, she has the idea, and she comes back, and she says, I figured out how to kill Harold Crick. And Queen Latifah says, how did you figure it out? How did you get that idea? And she said, well, Penny, the idea came the way they always do, inexplicably and without method. And anybody who's ever written, I think, understands that line.
Yeah, I agree.
Yep.
Yeah. Inexplicably and without, that's like the story of my life. Inexplicable and without method.
Yep. Look good on a tombstone, wouldn't it?
Yeah, God. Yeah.
My tombstone is going to read, you're standing on my face. So do you ever contemplate, and I think Strange Weather is a really good example, that you have three supernatural fantasy stories, and one story which is very realistic, which is Loaded, very much something that we read about in the headlines. And I think what fascinated me, particularly for somebody who's worked for newspapers, is how different an actual event is that you've seen, as opposed to what you see on the news.
Right.
And
well, so this guy was a demented fella who shot up a movie theater in Colorado. And I saw someone online, this is back when I was still doing social media, which I try to avoid nowadays. I don't think it's real healthy for you. But this guy said, this is why concealed carry is important. And let me tell you, if I had been in that movie theater, that story would have ended differently. And I remember thinking, what are you talking about, you fool? You know, it would have ended differently. Everyone stands up in a dark movie theater screaming and you pull out your gun, start shooting. It would have ended differently for a whole bunch of people because there would have been twice as many people dead. You know, and it's this idea that just owning a gun somehow makes you a gunslinger, you know, is just bizarre. And the whole theory of, you know, the good guy with a gun rests on the idea that merely buying, you know, merely possessing the gun somehow means that you're prepared for an active fire situation, which in fact are almost impossible to prepare for and involve a lot of confusion and collateral damage. And you know, the people who survive them, trained professionals, you know, police officers who have been in gunfights, spend years recovering from them, you know. And I hate this kind of fantasy version of gun violence, and I wanted to write about that. And the story is about a guy who appears to stop a mass shooting in a mall. And he's the good guy with the gun. He's a mall cop. It's like Paul Blart, mall cop, gone horribly wrong. He's the good guy with a gun, and he starts doing all the news interviews and stuff. He becomes a national star. But under the pressure of the national spotlight, his story starts to come apart, and his sanity starts to come apart with it. And eventually he reaches for the gun again. And I don't want to say too much about it, but you know, because I don't want to give a whole bunch away. But you know, I wrote that story, and about 6 months later, this demented guy shot up a newsroom and killed Carl Hiaasen's brother, and a great crime writer, Florida crime writer, Carl Hiaasen, and killed a bunch of other journalists. And it just gave me a terrible feeling, because you know, we're living in a moment where, you know, if you're writing about gun violence, anything you could imagine, if it hasn't happened, will happen. You know, it was just too, you know, I found that very disconcerting, you know. And we do live in a moment when, you know, unfortunately, you know, you're not safe in church, you're not safe in you know, movie theater, you're not safe in school. You know, the thought that the kids have to practice gun drills, that arts classes and music classes have been canceled so that school boards can afford to buy metal detectors. Somehow it just doesn't seem like the place we want to be. You know, like I'm not exactly sure how we got to this moment where everyone is huddled in a defensive crouch, and you know, parents are sending kids to school with backpacks that have Kevlar in them, so that they can duck behind the backpack and the bullets will bounce off them. And there's got to be a better way. It just doesn't seem like that could possibly be the best strategy for a large society. You know, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But anyway, oh, thanks.
is it a placebo, though, when they do this? It's like when I was a kid, it was, we had the nuclear drills.
Yeah.
And you went out in the hallway and you ducked and covered, and you put your head down like that was going to help you survive a nuclear holocaust.
The difference is that the missiles never fell, but the bullets are falling.
True.
You know, that unfortunately it is happening. Right. And I do think maybe one thing that would help is if, it does seem there's and people are on different sides of this thing, and it seems like sometimes like there's never any common ground. But one thing that I do think there are a lot of fixes that are just not going to happen anytime soon in this country. But one thing that has been getting talked about that I do think is a healthy thing is when the family can say, he's not well and he's making plans. He's got guns and he's making plans to use them. There does seem to be room for law enforcement to have an immediate injunction to come in and take the guns away and for a while, for a couple weeks and have some kind of evaluation. I also think a big thing is, I wanted to write about a lot of different facets of gun violence in America because the mass shootings are just the most obvious. But there's also, all these young black kids who are totally unarmed, who have been shot by police or wannabe police, wannabe cops, make believe cops in Florida and stuff, and I wanted to talk about that. I also wanted to talk about here's a scene that happens in America. It happens every night. It's happening somewhere tonight. You got a guy who's a good neighborhood dude. He has backyard barbecues, he's got 2 kids and his wife, and he works hard 40 hours a week, and he's got a smile for everyone. Nice guy, and he owns guns. Good guy, though. But he has a couple drinks, and he's sitting in the kitchen, and he says to his wife, "You ever leave me, I'll shoot you, and I'll shoot them." And he's got the gun, and he's waving it around. That scene plays out in America every single night, somewhere. And that's gun violence too. And I do think that one thing, and a lot of states have this, and it seems to be coming, I do think, you take the back of your hand to your wife, you can say goodbye to your guns. That's not going to happen anymore. It should just be understood that because over and over again when you see these guys who have shoot up the school, shoot up the movie theater, shoot up the church, there's always domestic violence. It's amazing the correlation between because they build up to it. Just like serial killers build up to it by strangling cats. This is a cheery conversation. Boy, do I know how to bring the fun or what?
I was just going to say, on that bright note, this is always one of my favorite things when I speak or when somebody else speaks, is when we declared Open Line Friday and we opened it up to the audience.
Yeah.
For anybody who
long time
wants to
listener,
ask
first time
questions.
caller.
That's right. Bunch of ditto heads out here, right? So I think we will do that.
They have mics.
Yes, I'm trying to see if, is there a mic near this person at the back? I'm supposed to pick out people that a microphone is
There's someone
near.
over there who's got a mic. Hi, how are you? You having a good time?
Hi, Joe. Yes, I just want to let you know that I love you and your family. You have entertained me for very many years.
Oh, you're so kind.
And everything that you write is wonderful. So thank you very much.
Thanks. That's my kind of question.
Yeah.
I think the question was, how did you get so great? Well, let me tell you.
I'd like to say he doesn't have the advantage I had. My father was a truck driver. My mother was a postal carrier, so I had nothing to live up to. I couldn't drive and I couldn't deliver mail. This guy came from a family of powerhouse writers.
Well, Jay Leno used to have this joke about Steve King. It used to be like, Steve King says to the kids, "Do you want to hear a bedtime story?" And the kids go, "No!" But actually, my dad told great bedtime stories.
I bet he did.
And this camera's pointing at me, and this is going to be like on NPR, so they're probably going to want to edit this part out. My dad used to tell us Spider-Man stories when I was a kid. And one of the reasons why it was so great to get to write my own, because this was something I shared with my dad. My dad understood instinctively that when he told my sister and I Spider-Man stories, that he couldn't kill Spider-Man because the comics were still coming out. Obviously, Spider-Man wasn't dead. But there are worse things than death, especially when you're a little kid, like humiliation. And my dad understood the great power of humiliation. So he would tell these Spider-Man stories like, okay, so Peter Parker is like out on the street, and he's eating a chili dog, and it's not tasting too good, but he's really hungry, so he's eating it down. He's like, I wonder if there's something. And then suddenly the lizard bursts out of the sewer, and he's wreaking havoc in New York City. And Spider-Man's like, Peter Parker's like, I gotta jump into action. So he throws on the Spider-Man suit and he webs down and he's like fighting the lizard. And the lizard winds up and buries his reptilian fist in Spider-Man's stomach. Spider-Man doubles over and his bowels let go, and he just fills the super suit with shit, you know? And like as kids, my sister and me would be like, no! We'd just scream. We'd scream in anguish. And my dad had perfected this look. And it was a look that seemed to say, I don't write the news, I just report it. You know? Flash forward 30 years, I got to write my own Spider-Man story, and I'm very proud of it. It was a big breakthrough for me. At the time, I was a failed novelist, and getting that chance to write Spider-Man was everything to me. But the Spider-Man story I wrote is actually kind of dull. It's probably like one of my worst published pieces. And I swear, if I ever get a chance, I was nervous. I kind of choked, you know. I didn't want to fail. And so I wound up writing a very generic Spider-Man story. If I ever get a chance to write the character again, he's crap in the Spidey suit. First page. First page, baby.
Did that answer your question? I'm looking to see where the microphones are. I have to link up the microphones.
Yeah, there's microphones back there, so go ahead.
Excellent.
Yeah.
We'll get to everybody.
Hi. Sorry, very loud. Hi, I'm very excited to be here. Hi, Joe.
Oh, hey, thank you so much.
I wanted to say, first of all, I discovered Heart-Shaped Box one day in the bookstore, read the back blurb, and it was just like, wow, it said something about, you know, once you start reading this, you can't put it down, and it was true. I just like was immersed by it. And then I had no idea your pedigree at that time, but I heard you had a collection of short stories. And I, found that, read 20th Century Ghost, amazing. But what I want to know is, how did you make me care about a balloon?
Yeah, the Balloon Boy, right, the Arthur Roth. That was the first short story I wrote that really came to life. You know, Arthur Roth is the story of a juvenile delinquent who befriends, Pop Art is the story of a juvenile delinquent who befriends an inflatable boy named Arthur Roth. Arthur's made of plastic filled with air. He weighs about 6 ounces, and if he sat on a sharpened pencil, it would kill him. And but otherwise, he's a normal boy, and he can't speak, of course. So he writes everything, and he has to write in crayons because a sharp pen would be dangerous. And when I wrote the story, I thought it would be silly, but as I wrote it, I found out it was actually about certain kinds of friendships sometimes people have when they're young, and they will meet someone who's not going to get to be a grown-up. You know, and that does happen. You know, we do sometimes, befriend someone in school who's already fighting some kind of aggressive illness, and it's pretty clear that they're not going to get to experience the things you're going to get to experience. And it just, I read a review once when I was a teenager about a science fiction film that I hadn't really liked, but I couldn't figure out why I didn't like it. And the reviewer said, this movie is a failure because it's not about anything except itself, which is almost like this very enigmatic statement. What does that mean? But gradually I came to feel that was correct, that stories succeed when they ask big questions. We read nonfiction to find out the answers to questions that can be answered. But we read fiction to wrestle with questions that don't really have simple, concrete answers. Every ghost story is there because none of us know what happens when we die. And every person in this room will soon be dead. The night gets cheerier and cheerier. But it's true. But it's true. On the vast scale of time, we all only get a few moments and then it's over. And we know it, and it's scary. And yet, it's part of our job as human beings to wrestle with it, to wrestle with what that means, to have a finite life. And one of the ways we wrestle with the concept of death is with ghost stories. So my silly story about an inflatable boy turned out, was about something after all, and that's why I think it was one of the first stories I was able to sell. Not because, not to be really mercantile, but because, the editor could feel it had something in it, that it was about something. Sure.
Up here.
Yes, this is directed to Loren. It's great that you could come up here to have both of you at the same night on the stage.
great to be here. Thank you.
But we were fortunate enough to live downtown Ann Arbor for about 7 years on 4th Avenue. And one of the hidden joys great joys on 4th Ave was Aunt Agatha's
Right.
bookstore. And one of the great joys of that was having you come in and do readings every time you had a new book. So I thank you for that, Loren Estleman.
Thank
It
you.
was great.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's always sad when a bookstore closes. I do like to mention, though, that Jamie and Robin Agnew, who ran the store, will continue to conduct signings at the Ann Arbor Public Library. So we will be doing some more of those with them. The good thing that happened to me out of that was I got to buy their Pocket Books book rack from the 50s. It's got the kangaroo on it, says 25 cents, so that's in my basement library now. So I got something good out of it, but it was sad to see that go. Thank you so much for bringing that up.
Yeah, down there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, so I'm interested in what the process is like to adapt one of the novels that you've written into television or film. Did you adapt the Nosferatu series, for example?
I've been very lucky because I've had a lot of stuff that's sort of churning through that's either been adapted or is on its way to being adapted. A Snapshot and Strange Weather is being developed by a fellow named Mike Flanagan, who directed several great horror films, including Oculus, and he worked on The Haunting of Hill House, which is going to be on Netflix. Nosferatu, I didn't work on any of the scripts. It's been developed by a woman named Jamie O'Brien, who did Fear the Walking Dead, and she's terrific. I read her pilot script, and I thought it was like one of the best screenplays I'd ever read in my life, and I thought, I'm not going to get underfoot and ruin this. I'll just stay out of it. Lock and Key, the comic book, has been adapted to television several times and has just never made it on the air. There was a production in 2010 for Fox that was directed by Mark Romanek, who did 1 Hour Photo and Never Let Me Go. And it was written by Joshua Friedman, who did The Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles for TV. It came out great. It was very scary. Fox decided they only had one slot for one new show, and they decided to do Alcatraz instead, and you see how that worked out. They got what they deserved. Later, I did write the pilot episode for a new version of Lock and Key, and it was directed, they filmed the pilot for Hulu, and it was directed by a fellow named Andy Muschietti. Now, Andy Muschietti had done a brilliant horror film called Mama that was very scary, and then his career took a left-hand turn, and he did a family film set in the 80s about 8 kids who meet a magical clown in their small town of Maine, Derry, Maine, and they go on adventures together. And so that was great. So I thought, but I wanted him to get back to doing something scary. So I asked Andy to direct Lock and Key. He did. It came out great. But midway through the shooting, Hulu hired a new CEO who came out of Fox Sports. And I think he didn't like to be scared. This is my theory. I have no proof for that, but I think he didn't. So Hulu passed on the pilot. Now it's in the hands of Netflix, who bought some of the material from Hulu, including the big Key House set. We built Key House from the comic. And so they've got the Key House set and the Well House, and they've got some scripts that, because we had written something like 6-7 episodes for the first season. And so that has a straight to series order and is going to be filmed in February. I was very involved. I wasn't much involved with the Fox version. I'm not terribly involved with the Netflix version. I've done some of my work on the Hulu version has made its way into the Netflix version, which seems to be very strong. I'm very happy with what they've got. But after spending 2 years on the Hulu version, I was burned out. I couldn't come back to the story. Netflix is also, I wrote a short story with my dad called In the Tall Grass, and Netflix just wrapped the filming of a movie based on that story, which should be out, I think, October of next year. Over there?
You talked earlier about Nosferatu and how Zachary Quinto is going to be playing Charlie Manx, but
Yeah.
for me, Kate Mulgrew is always going to be Charlie Manx in my head. I wanted her performance of the audiobook of
That's
Nosferatu.
a very strange comment, right? But I understand him completely.
It's her vocal performance of Nosferatu is stunning. And I was just wondering, how involved are you in selecting readers to bring your works to life in the audiobook format? Because it added a whole dimension to that novel that wasn't there before.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. I love audiobooks, and I hope, yeah, I hope some of you guys. And can we just end one nonsense argument? You know, reading a book on audio is reading a book. That is reading a book. It's not like you didn't read the book if you listen to the whole thing. And science actually proves it. Did you know that when you read a book, the part of your brain that lights up is the part that listens? Which I find really fascinating. The critic Harold Bloom said that listening to audiobooks is not reading. And Neil Gaiman, who I love, replied that Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, would have been surprised to learn that because he was blind and everything was read to him by his daughters. And so Milton would have been very surprised to learn he had never read a book. But I love the audiobooks, and I think very carefully about the readers. There are 3 readers I particularly like that I've worked with a lot. The first novel, Heart-Shaped Box, was read by the actor Stephen Lang, who was the bad guy in Avatar. And he has this great, tough, gravelly voice, and I love that voice, and he's read several of my stories since then. I fell in love with Kate Mulgrew's reading of one of my short stories by the Silver Waters of Lake Champlain, and in a lot of ways, this will sound strange, but she's almost like my female voice. When I write a story from a female perspective, I hear it in her voice. She read Nosferatu on audio for me. She read The Fireman on audio for me. She read Rain with the narrator Honeysuckle Speck. That's her in the audio book. And you know, a great reading can take a good book and make it great, and can make a great book into an experience you never forget. So I definitely care about the quality of the reading, and love when the books are done well on audio. That's terrific.
Me too. I had an early exposure to books on audio. My father retired when he lost his eyesight, and we would get Library of Congress books for the blind on old records, and I think they played like 8 RPM or something like that. You would have a whole book on 3 or 4 records, and the whole family would gather around and listen to those.
That's wonderful.
It was wonderful.
I'll tell you a crazy story. I want to get on to another question, but I got to tell you this one. You know, when I was a teenager, my favorite book was Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. And then, I love that book. I listened to it on audio. And then when I was in my 20s, my favorite book of all time was The Fixer by Bernard Malamud. And in both cases, and I listened to that on audio too. And in both cases, it was very strange because, I'm not a cattleman. I've never gone on, I don't know anything about cows or riding horses and stuff, but I love this cowboy story. And then, I'm definitely not an elderly Jewish carpenter who's been wrongly sentenced to, convicted for a crime he didn't commit and sentenced to a gulag in Russia. But I totally responded to, The Fixer. And then years later, I was cleaning up my basement, and I came across the old audiobooks, and I found the audiobook for Lonesome Dove, and I found the audiobook by The Fixer, and discovered they were both read by the same reader, Wolfram Kadinsky.
Mm-hmm. Terrific.
So,
I covered the filming of Lonesome Dove for TV Guide. It's one of the highlights of my life.
Oh, what a great film.
It was.
What a great film. Yeah. Go ahead.
we're getting close to wrapping this up, so one more question, and Joe is going to be signing books.
Someone there has a question they desperately want to ask. Can we have that one? And we can also we can do a speed round. Go ahead. You go, and then you go, and then she'll go, and then we'll be done.
Hi, Joe.
Hi.
You've been like a spiritual mentor to me, and I'm just, wow.
Oh, hey, thanks so much.
Anyways, I'm just wondering, what is your favorite horror author besides your father?
Right. What's my I don't probably Donald Trump's Art of the Deal. Scariest thing I've ever read. Yeah. Go ahead.
Joe, I, like a lot of people, have started my own collection of Stephen King novels, and tonight I started my Joe Hill collection.
Oh, you're so kind. I hope you like them.
So, thank you. My question, I've recently read a story that the Tolkien estate his descendants have continued on with the Middle Earth series.
Aren't they publishing his laundry list now?
Are there any stories that your father started that you would like to continue?
I've had the good fortune to write a couple short stories with him. You know, when I was a younger guy, you know, especially when I was coming up, it was really important to me that when I sold stories, I sold them for the right reasons. And that's why I dropped the last name and started writing as Joe Hill. And you know, I wrote a bunch of novels I was never able to sell, and you know, and gradually learned my craft and sold short stories, and you know, eventually did sell a book, you know, under the pen name without the guy finding out who my dad was, and that was important to me. I needed that for my self-confidence.
I think that was very wise. That way you don't ever ask that question of yourself, did I make this
That I
on
only
my
make
own?
it because,
Right.
but so if I had written a really lousy book and it got published because I had a famous dad,
Right.
you know, I would have found that out too, because people would tell me.
Yeah.
You know, because they wouldn't finish it, because ultimately it doesn't matter who you're related to. You know, someone's reading your book and they don't like it, they won't finish. You know, and there goes your career in a puff of smoke. Still, I'm a lot more secure than I was when I was in my early 30s, my late 20s and early 30s, and trying to make it. And you know, generally most people do know who my dad is at this point. I'm a huge Stephen King fan. I love my dad's work. I love my dad. He's one of my best friends in the world. And I got to write a couple short stories with him. My brother Owen wrote a brilliant novel with him called Sleeping Beauties. And you know, getting to sort of talk now about how much I admire his work and how much I admire the kind of life he's lived feels good, you know. And I, but in terms of is there any stories he's ever put down? I'm waiting for him to come back to him. You know, I'm always eager for the next book.
I would always like to recommend for anybody who wants to write, read Stephen King's On Writing. This is a terrific book.
It is a great book, except for me, because the thing is like I already heard all those stories and stuff like that, so it's a little less, Right. Well, one more question. We have one more question, or
Get a
I don't
question
wanna
up here in the balcony. Hello, Mr. Hill.
Oh, up
We
there.
haven't done much
Oh,
in
hey,
the
yeah,
upstairs
cool.
balcony.
Thank you.
So sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
I just have a quick yes or no question. Will there be more Lock and Key in graphic novel form? That's it.
If Netflix really does do the TV show and we really get a whole TV show, there'll be a new series that I'll do with my soul brother Gabriel Rodriguez. It will be another 6 books. The first series was 6 books long. This would be another 6-book series called World War Key. The first book would be called World War Key Revolution, and the second book would be called World War Key Resurrection. Me and him have the whole thing mapped out, and it's just a question of whether there's an appetite for it, and presumably if there's a TV show, there'll be an appetite for it. So I know we're out of time. We've actually gone past our time. I just want to thank Loren again.
Thank you.
For letting me to share a moment on stage with him. As a
Thank you
huge
for
admirer.
inviting me. It's been a delight.
And thanks to you guys for coming out and supporting the series.
Thank you.